The frost did not sit lightly upon the valley floor that year. Instead, it clamped down with a crushing weight that turned the soil into iron long before the first snow had even threatened to fall. Elizabeth stood at the edge of her property, looking not at the expansive, flat grazing lands where her neighbors were frantically reinforcing their timber barns, but at the steep, south-facing ridge that bordered her land. It was an imposing rise of earth, thick with scrub brush and rocky outcroppings, usually ignored by the cattlemen who preferred the ease of the level plains. To the casual observer, Elizabeth was a figure of pity, a widow left alone with 3 horses and a dwindling supply of cured firewood that everyone knew would not last through a Dakota winter. The talk in the settlement, a collection of rough-hewn structures 3 miles east, was that she would be forced to sell her livestock for pennies or risk freezing to death alongside them. But Elizabeth was not calculating the price of lumber or the cost of coal. She was measuring the angle of the sun and the depth of the frost line. She held a heavy iron spade in her gloved hands, the metal cold enough to burn through the leather, and she did not look toward the forest for salvation. She looked down. The decision to dig was not born of madness, though that was the diagnosis whispered in the general store and the blacksmith's shop. It was born of a memory of the root cellars from her childhood, places where the apples stayed crisp and the water never froze, regardless of how the blizzards raged above. Elizabeth walked to the base of the ridge, finding a spot where the earth rose sharply enough to provide a natural ceiling but where the soil was stable, bound together by the deep, tangled roots of the ancient prairie grass. She struck the ground. The first blow rang out like a hammer hitting an anvil, the frozen topsoil resisting the intrusion. She struck again, and then again, chipping away the frozen crust until she reached the softer, darker earth beneath. It was slow, rhythmic labor, the kind that strips the mind of worry and replaces it with a dull ache of muscle. She was not building up, she was going in. The wind cannot take what it cannot find, she murmured to herself, the steam from her breath vanishing instantly into the dry, biting air. She was not merely digging a hole, she was carving a sanctuary, betting her survival on the thermal constancy of the deep earth rather than the fragile protection of wooden planks. As the sun began to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the snowless ground, she had made only a shallow dent, a scar in the hillside that looked, to the few riders passing by on the distant road, disturbingly like the beginning of a grave. By the second week, the scar in the hill had become a cavernous mouth. Elizabeth had moved tons of earth, wheeling it out barrow by barrow, her silhouette against the hillside becoming a fixture of the landscape. The labor had changed her hands were calloused and hard, her movements efficient and stripped of any wasted energy. She had dug past the frost line, entering a layer of soil that felt strangely alive compared to the dead, frozen world above. Down here, the earth crumbled readily, smelling of damp age and minerals. It was during this phase, when she was waist-deep in the cut, that Thomas arrived. He was a cattleman of the old school, a man who believed in straight fences and timber barns, and he sat atop his gelding looking down at her with a mixture of confusion and genuine concern. He did not dismount, keeping his distance as if her madness might be contagious. "Elizabeth," he called out, his voice sharp against the silence of the valley. "The ground is freezing hard. You should be chopping what wood you have left, not playing in the dirt. Those horses of yours won't survive a week in the open while you dig this." Whatever this is, Elizabeth paused, resting her weight on the handle of her shovel. She wiped the sweat from her forehead, a stark contrast to Thomas, who was bundled in wool and shivering slightly in the biting breeze. "They won't be in the open, Thomas," she replied, her voice steady and lacking the defensive shrillness he had expected. "And I have no intention of burning wood to heat the sky." She pointed to the walls of the cut she had made. "Put your hand on the dirt, Thomas." He hesitated, his brow furrowing, but curiosity compelled him. He leaned down from his saddle, stripping off a thick glove to press his palm against the exposed vertical wall of the trench. His eyes widened slightly. The earth was not warm, exactly, but it was not cold. It held a steady, neutral temperature, utterly indifferent to the freezing wind that whipped at his coat. "It's 50 degrees down here," Elizabeth said, turning back to her work. "It stays 50 degrees all year round. In summer, it's a cellar. In winter, it's a furnace compared to the air." Thomas pulled his hand back, wiping the dirt on his trousers. He looked at the sky, then back at the woman who was disappearing into the hill. It's a tomb, Elizabeth. The damp will kill them if the cold doesn't. You're digging a grave for those beasts. He turned his horse and rode away, shaking his head, convinced that grief had finally severed her tether to reality. The excavation continued, driven by a deadline set by the darkening sky. Elizabeth knew the geology of the hill was her ally, but it also demanded respect. She shaped the ceiling of her underground stable in a gentle arch, mimicking the strength of an eggshell, allowing the immense weight of the hill to distribute itself down the walls rather than collapsing in the center. She did not use heavy timber beams for the roof, for she had none to spare. Instead, she used the earth itself, reinforced with a few strategic posts she had salvaged from a fallen fence. The most critical piece of engineering, however, was invisible to the casual observer. She dug a narrow, vertical shaft at the rear of the chamber, tunneling upward until she broke the surface high on the hill's slope. This was the lung of the stable. She knew that without ventilation, the moisture from the horse's breath would accumulate, turning the shelter into a suffocating, mold-ridden trap. She fashioned a small chimney from stones and clay above the exit hole to prevent snow from drifting in. As she worked on the drainage channels along the floor, lining them with gravel to carry urine away from the bedding area, the first true snowstorm of the season began to accumulate. The world outside turned white and silent, the wind howling with a ferocity that rattled the windows of her small cabin down the slope. But inside the hillside, the air remained still. The howling wind was nothing more than a distant vibration in the ground. Martha, the wife of the local storekeeper, made the trek out to Elizabeth's property 2 days later, her face wrapped in scarves, carrying a basket of dried meat and flour. She found Elizabeth not in the cabin, but emerging from the dark moor of the stable, her face smudged with clay but her eyes bright. "We were worried," Martha said, her voice muffled by the wool. "Samuel said you hadn't bought coal in weeks. He thinks you're freezing to death out here." Elizabeth took the basket with a nod of thanks but didn't offer the expected platitudes. "Keep your coal, Martha. You'll need it when the mercury drops." "My heating is already paid for in sweat." Martha peered into the dark tunnel, shivering as the wind cut through her layers. "It looks like a bear's den, Elizabeth." "It's not right for civilized creatures." Elizabeth only smiled, a small, tight expression. "Civilization is cold this year, Martha. The earth is honest." The true test arrived on a Tuesday, under a sky so clear and blue it felt like ice. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. The air itself seemed to shatter. Elizabeth led her 3 horses, a roan mare, a sturdy gelding, and an aging quarter horse, out of the drafty, rattling wooden shed where they had been shivering violently. Their coats were puffed out, a desperate attempt to trap body heat, and their breath came in thick, distressed clouds. They resisted at the entrance of the underground stable. The darkness frightened them, it went against their instinct to flee across open ground. Elizabeth was patient. She spoke to them in a low, rhythmic hum, her hand firm on the lead rope of the mare. "Easy now. Out of the wind." Come out of the wind. She stepped into the gloom, and after a moment of tossing her head, the mare followed. The transition was immediate and physical, a sensory shock that stopped Elizabeth in her tracks. One moment, the cold was a physical assault, biting at her exposed skin and making her lungs ache. The next, as they crossed the threshold and descended the gentle ramp into the heart of the hill, the air softened. It was heavy with the scent of raw earth and dry roots, but the bite was gone. The wind, which had been deafening outside, was instantly silenced, replaced by the muffled thud of hooves on the dirt floor. She led the horses to the stalls she had carved from the living soil, tying them loosely. She waited. Within minutes, the shivering stopped. The insulation of 10 feet of soil overhead trapped the radiant heat from the horses' large bodies, and with no wind to strip that heat away, the temperature in the stable began to inch upward, settling comfortably around 55 degrees. The horses lowered their heads, sniffing the gravel drains and the straw bedding. They began to chew. The sound of grinding hay in the absolute stillness of the underground chamber was the loudest sound in the world. Elizabeth sat on a wooden crate in the corner, watching her breath. It did not mist as heavily here. She took a thermometer from her pocket and set it on a ledge. It held steady. She had beaten the winter, and she hadn't burned a single splinter of wood to do it. January brought a blizzard that buried the county under 5 feet of snow. The roads were impassable, the telegraph line snapped under the weight of the ice. In the settlement, the situation was becoming dire. Woodpiles that had been stacked high in November were now reduced to kindling, and families were beginning to eye their furniture with desperate calculation. The cold was relentless, finding every crack in the clapboard houses, freezing water in the basins within feet of the hearths. Thomas, whose skepticism had been so vocal weeks earlier, sat in his kitchen, wrapped in 2 blankets, watching the frost creep up the inside of his window pane. His own barn was a miserable place. Despite his best efforts to plug the drafts with rags and straw, his livestock were suffering. He could hear them kicking the stalls, restless with the cold. His thoughts turned to Elizabeth. He felt a pang of guilt, heavy and cold in his gut. If his prize cattle were suffering in a barn that had cost him a year's earnings to build, the widow's horses in a hole in the ground must surely be dead. He imagined them frozen stiff, encased in the tomb she had dug for them. The guilt gnawed at him until he could sit still no longer. Wrapping himself in every layer he owned, he saddled his horse, which fought him, unwilling to go out into the white oat, and began the brutal trek toward Elizabeth's Ridge. The journey took him hours. The snow was blinding, erasing the horizon, and more than once he almost turned back. When he finally reached the base of the hill, he couldn't see the cabin or the stable entrance. Everything was a smooth, white undulation of snow. "Elizabeth," he shouted, the wind tearing the name from his lips. He stumbled forward, probing the snow with a stick, fearing what he would find. He found the entrance only because the snow had melted slightly around the wooden doorframe, a subtle sign of escaping heat. He hammered on the rough planks of the door, his hands numb. "Elizabeth! It's Thomas! Open up!" There was no answer. Bracing himself for the sight of carcasses, he shoved the heavy door open and stumbled into the darkness. Thomas braced himself against the doorframe, his chest heaving as he prepared to witness the tragic aftermath of a widow's folly, but the stench of death did not greet him. Instead, he was hit by a wall of air that smelled of living things, rich damp earth, sweet crushed timothy grass, and the unmistakable musk of horses. It was not hot, but the sudden absence of the biting frost made the air feel tropical against his frozen cheeks. He blinked, his eyelashes heavy with ice, trying to adjust his vision to the dim lantern light that flickered deep within the hillside. "Close the door, Thomas," a voice said calmly from the shadows. "You're letting the winter in." Elizabeth was sitting on her upturned crate, a leather harness in her lap that she was mending with a calm, methodical rhythm. She did not look like a woman under siege, she looked like a woman passing a quiet Tuesday. Thomas pushed the heavy wooden door shut, the latch falling into place with a dull thud that sealed out the howling gale. The silence that followed was profound. The screaming wind was reduced to a distant, meaningless hum, and the only sounds were the soft shifting of hooves and the rhythmic crunch of jaws working on hay. Thomas stumbled forward, his legs stiff from the ride, and stripped the frozen glove from his right hand. He reached out, not to touch Elizabeth, but to touch the flank of the roan mare standing nearest to him. The horse's coat was dry and warm. There was no shivering, no puffed fur, no desperate huddling. She turned her head to look at him with mild disinterest before returning to her feed. Thomas felt a laugh bubble up in his throat, a jagged sound bordering on hysteria. "They're warm," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My God, Elizabeth, they're actually warm." He looked around the chamber, seeing the smooth, arched ceiling of packed earth, the drainage ditches that kept the floor dry, and the steady rise of steam from the animals' backs that drifted toward a vent in the rear. "Physics, Thomas," she said, finally looking up at him, her eyes clear and unblinking. "The earth doesn't care about the blizzard. It only knows what is deep and what is shallow. You were fighting the wind with planks of dead wood. I let the hill do the work." Thomas sank to the floor, leaning his back against the dirt wall, and for the first time in 3 days, he stopped shaking. The storm raged for another 4 days, a white hurricane that buried the valley in drifts deep enough to swallow a manhole, yet inside the hill, time seemed to function differently. Thomas stayed, not because he was trapped by the snow, but because his horse refused to leave the sanctuary of the stable, and truthfully, so did he. He watched Elizabeth work with a kind of reverent fascination, observing how she managed the invisible currents of air. She explained to him, in sparse, purposeful sentences, how the heat generated by the 3 horses rose to the ceiling and was drawn out through the rear chimney she had bored through the hill, creating a natural vacuum that pulled fresh, oxygenated air in through the gaps around the door. "It breathes," she told him on the second night, pointing to the candle flame that leaned steadily toward the back of the cave. "If it didn't breathe, the damp would kill them as surely as the cold." "You have to let the heat move." Thomas thought of his own barn, a tightly sealed box of expensive lumber where the air grew stagnant and icy, and he realized with a sinking heart that he had built a coffin while she had built a lung. They rationed their food, dried beef and hard biscuits, and they slept in the straw next to the animals, the heat of the large bodies acting as a living radiator. Outside, the world was ending. Inside, the temperature hovered at 54 degrees. When the wind finally died down and the silence of the aftermath settled over the valley, Thomas dug his way out. He emerged into a blindingly bright morning, blinking against the glare of the snow. He looked back at the humble wooden door set into the hillside, barely visible under the drifts, and then toward the settlement in the distance. He knew what he would find there, and the dread lay heavy in his stomach. He mounted his horse, which snorted and danced in the cold air, and rode toward town, a messenger carrying news of a miracle that no one would believe. The devastation in the settlement was absolute. The blizzard had stripped the illusion of safety from the town, revealing just how fragile their existence on the plains truly was. Fences were buried, roofs had collapsed under the weight of the snow, and the silence was heavy with loss. As Thomas rode down the main street, he saw men dragging stiff, frozen carcasses of cattle and horses onto sleds, their faces gray with exhaustion and defeat. The woodpiles were gone, people had burned their furniture, their fences, and even the floorboards of their parlors in a desperate bid to keep the frostbite at bay. He found the blacksmith, a burly man named Jeb, standing outside his shop, staring blankly at a pile of scrap metal. "We lost the team," Jeb said without preamble, his voice flat. "Barn roof held, but the cold got them anyway." Froze standing up, Thomas dismounted, feeling the alien warmth of Elizabeth's stable still clinging to his clothes. "Elizabeth's horses are fine," Thomas said quietly. Jeb looked at him, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "The widow? Don't tell me stories, Thomas. She's likely dead in that cabin of hers." "No one's seen smoke from her chimney in 3 days. She wasn't in the cabin," Thomas replied, his voice gaining strength. "She was in the hill. In the ground. It's 50 degrees in there, Jeb. I slept in there without a coat. Her horses are eating hay and drinking water that isn't ice." The statement hung in the freezing air like a blasphemy. Other men gathered around, drawn by the conversation, their expressions shifting from grief to skepticism. "You're telling us," the storekeeper called out, shivering in a moth-eaten coat, "that while we were burning our chairs to survive, the widow was cozy in a dirt hole?" Thomas nodded. "She didn't fight the winter. She went under it. And unless you want to lose the rest of your stock when the next freeze comes tonight, you might want to stop calling her crazy and start asking her how she did it." The desperation in the crowd was palpable. Pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. The pilgrimage to the ridge began an hour later. It was a ragged procession of defeated men and shivering animals, a stark contrast to the arrogant confidence of the cattle drives in the autumn. They brought their surviving prize mares, their milk cows, anything that could still walk, leading them through the chest-deep snow toward the widow's property. Elizabeth was outside when they arrived, clearing the snow from the ventilation chimney on the upper slope of the hill. She stopped her work and leaned on her shovel, watching the line of men approach. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply watched them with the same pragmatic detachment she applied to the weather. Thomas rode at the front, acting as a reluctant ambassador. "They're asking for space, Elizabeth," he called out, gesturing to the shivering livestock behind him. "Just for the breeding stock." "They know they were wrong." Elizabeth descended the hill slowly, her boots crunching in the snow. She looked at the animals, not the men. She saw the frostbite on their ears, the tremors in their flanks. "The stable is designed for 3 horses," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the stillness. "If we crowd them, the heat will rise too high. the moisture will build up, and pneumonia will take them. It is a balance, not a warehouse. The men looked at each other, panic flaring in their eyes. However, she continued, the heat equation changes if we expand the ventilation. If you are willing to dig, we can extend the tunnel. We can make room. But you will dig by my rules, and you will move the earth exactly where I say. It was an unconditional surrender of their authority. The men who had laughed at her spade grabbed the shovel she offered without a word of protest. The expansion of the underground stable became a fevered engineering project, driven by the terrifying clarity of survival. Under Elizabeth's direction, the men attacked the hillside. They did not dig haphazardly. She marked the walls with chalk, calculating the structural load of the earth above. Do not cut straight up, she instructed a young rancher named Caleb, who was swinging a pickaxe with more enthusiasm than skill. Archive the ceiling. If it is flat, it falls. If it curves, it holds. They worked in shifts, the heat of their bodies and the lanterns quickly warming the new section of the tunnel. As they dug, they began to understand the genius of her design. They felt the temperature shift as they broke through the frost line, the soil turning from frozen concrete to pliable, dense earth. It was a lesson in geology that none of them would ever forget. They connected the new chamber to the old one, widening the drainage channels and adding a second ventilation shaft that Thomas punched through the surface 20 feet further up the ridge. By midnight, 12 more horses and 3 milk cows were stabled underground. The temperature in the expanded cavern rose to 58 degrees, a humid, biological warmth that felt miraculous compared to the 20 below zero reading on the thermometer outside. The animals settled instantly, their survival instincts recognizing the safety of the cave. The men sat on crates and barrels near the entrance, exhausted and humbled, drinking coffee brewed over a small spirit lamp. We spent years building barns to keep the weather out, the blacksmith murmured, looking at the ceiling of roots and soil. She just invited the earth in. Elizabeth did not join their circle. She was walking the line of horses, checking their hooves, ensuring the ventilation was drawing the ammonia away. She was not their savior, she was the architect of their survival, and that required vigilance, not celebration. Spring arrived not with a gentle thaw, but with a violent breakup of the river ice and a sun that turned the drifts into rushing torrents of mud. The valley transformed from a white wasteland to a brown, churning marsh. Throughout the county, the toll of the winter was laid bare. Timber barns stood empty and silent, their doors swinging in the breeze, while carcasses were dragged to the burn piles. But on the south-facing ridge, the scene was different. Elizabeth opened the heavy wooden door of the stable and led her roan mare out into the sunshine. The horse blinked, sniffing the fresh, muddy air, and shook its mane, healthy and sleek. Behind her, Thomas and the other neighbors led their own animals out. They were thinner, perhaps, but they were alive. Their ears were not frostbitten, their lungs were clear. The survival rate for the livestock kept in the underground stable was 100%. The men stood in the mud, looking at the hole in the hill that had saved their livelihoods. There was no more talk of madness. There was only a quiet, embarrassed reverence. Thomas walked over to Elizabeth, who was inspecting the hinges of the door, checking for rot. "We're going to rebuild," Thomas said, looking out at the ruined landscape of the valley. "But not with wood." "Not entirely," he kicked the dirt with his boot. "I'm thinking of cutting into the bank on my north pasture." "The soil is deep there," Elizabeth nodded, wiping a smudge of clay from her cheek. "Check the drainage first, Thomas. If the water has nowhere to go, you're just digging a well," he smiled, a genuine expression of respect. "Then maybe I'll come by and ask you to survey it first." Elizabeth looked at him, then at the ridge that had sheltered them all. "The land offers everything you need," she said quietly, closing the door to the empty stable. "You just have to be willing to get your hands dirty to find it."